LinkedIn News.
As humans, we have had to deal with disasters and apocalyptic situations since our earliest beginnings when there were earthquakes, there were floods, there were fires, wars, right? All of those things were happening and we had to adapt to them and with them. And so, as humans, we have unbelievable abilities for cooperation, for communication, for bonding with each other, for working together. So if we can put those things together, then I think there's a lot of hope, actually, for dealing with the challenges that we're facing in a way that will ultimately help humanity to thrive in the challenging times that we are in now and will be in the future as well.
That's cooperation theorist Athena Aktipis. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Stay tuned to find out how generosity could be the key to solving humanity's biggest challenges. Don't forget to hit that follow button to get new episodes of our show every week. And if you're a regular listener, first of all, thank you. And I have a favor to ask. Consider leaving us a review so we can keep bringing you more conversations that you love. If you don't know how, here's how to leave a review on Apple or Spotify. On Apple, go to the Everyday Better podcast page, scroll to the bottom, and click the number of stars you want to give. Then, right below that, click Write a Review and add your note to us. If you're a Spotify listener, go to our page, click the 3 dots next to the settings wheel, and select Rate Show. We so appreciate your feedback, and as always, thank you, thank you, thank you. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts who use science and story to share strategies for how we can flourish individually, in relationship to others, and to the world around us. Spend just a few minutes scrolling through social media or watching the news, and you are sure to be confronted with yet another major threat to our survival. War, hunger, climate change, natural disasters, even the advent of AI, it seems like the list goes on and on. And with so many overwhelming, seemingly impossible to solve issues, a scary question comes to mind for me. Are we totally doomed? My guest today spends a lot of time thinking about the end of the world. Athena Aktipis is a professor of psychology at Arizona State University and the author of A Field Guide to the Apocalypse, a mostly serious guide to surviving our trying times. She combines cooperation theory, evolutionary biology, game theory, and psychology to understand how humans behave in times of crisis. Athena's work shows that yes, we are facing many unprecedented challenges. But there's good news. Humans have evolved to live and survive in apocalyptic times. If you were an early human, you would be dealing with some pretty gnarly stuff. Famine, drought, disease. And there's a good chance that at some point in your lifetime, anywhere from 20 to 30% of your community would have died in one of these catastrophic events. Pretty crazy, right? And that's to say, we are descendants of survivors. So how did our ancestors get through all the chaos? Athena wants us all to know that in times of crisis, humans are surprisingly both cooperative and generous with each other. And this is the key to survival. So instead of ignoring all the threats that humanity faces, Athena wants us to think about them more. She says that when we do, we actually override our pessimism and tap into the qualities that will help us solve our biggest problems: generosity, creativity, and cooperation. Here's Athena.
I've always been interested in human behavior and understanding human behavior using science, especially an evolutionary perspective. And I've also always been very just intrinsically motivated to how can we make the world a better place? A lot of people have realized that the sort of promise that the world would just keep getting better for everyone is not really how it just automatically works, and that we have to be more active about thinking, about how do we take care of ourselves, our loved ones, and people who are more vulnerable than us. I have a few decades of research under my belt now looking at cooperation and how people help each other in times of need, and now really being able to jump into the side of, what do we do about it? How do we take that knowledge and actually make our lives better, make our communities better, and hopefully make a brighter future for all of us as a result?
So your most recent book is A Field Guide to the Apocalypse. And the thing that struck me about this book is that it's fun, it's kind of approachable, it's for the general public, it's got cool graphics in it and things like that. Why take that approach to something that, I think for many people feels really serious and oftentimes can feel very doom and gloom depending on how much you watch the news?
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly why we need it because, as humans, we have had to deal with disasters and apocalyptic situations since our earliest beginnings, and it can be very, very challenging. But if we're always sort of in a mindset of fear, then we can go into a mindset where we avoid rather than really actively dealing with it. And I think humor, storytelling, kind of having a sense of adventure, all of those are really, really important tools that we have in our toolkit for dealing with challenges, and especially a sense of humor, honestly. I mean, that's how I deal with all of the bad things in my life, is with a sense of humor. You kind of get to a point where you're like, yeah, well, at least like there's a good story and I'm getting a laugh out of it. And then it doesn't, a lot of things that otherwise would be hard to deal with don't feel as much like the end of the world.
Yeah. I can definitely be someone who ends up taking myself too seriously. Like that's one of my goals, is to be like, okay, relax, like taking everything a little less, not seriously, but like allowing myself to have some sort of humor. I want to go back because you said that, humans have had to deal with other crises and times, maybe not just like these, but things that presented disaster crises before. Are we like wrong to assume that we are in very unique times of crises that are different from anything anyone's ever dealt with, and maybe the worst it's ever been? Not to be doomy and gloomy, but...
Well, it definitely isn't the worst it's ever been. I mean, there are times that have been much worse in terms of war, in terms of pandemics. We have been dealing as humans with disasters, even in sort of prehistory, when there were earthquakes, there were floods, there were fires, wars, right? All of those things were happening, and we had to adapt to them and with them. And so as humans, we have unbelievable abilities for cooperation, for communication, for bonding with each other, for working together, and also having imagination and being adaptable, being ready to kind of go with the flow when we need to. And the scale of the challenges that we're facing today are unique. Like, that part is unique, but we still have all of these capacities that we can bring to bear on these problems. So if we can put those things together around our shared goals, then I think there's a lot of hope, actually, for dealing with the challenges that we're facing in a way that will help humanity to thrive in the challenging times that we are in now and will be in the future as well.
Okay, so just to be clear, you don't believe that like we are headed toward the most ultimate disaster and things are going to go terribly wrong?
I think that there's a huge probability cloud of like how things could go. Of course, it's possible there could be some huge unpredictable disaster that could happen, but I think that it's also quite likely that we'll just have lots of little disasters that will befall us. I think it's quite likely we'll have another pandemic in our lifetimes that'll be really serious. Just sort of looking at the numbers, the chances that the flu will mutate into something more lethal than COVID in our lifetimes is just about, 1 in 2. So I think it's likely that there will be, events in the next decades that will be very challenging. What those events will be exactly, it's harder to say, but if you add up sort of all the probabilities of all the things that could go wrong, we're going to be dealing with some shit in the future.
Right.
We don't just know exactly what flavor.
Right. And at the same time, like, not everything could go wrong. Like, something could go wrong and then we figure it out, which, I mean, we've done many times in the past. Again, I joked about the news earlier, but I actually do think that like watching or overwatching the news can make you believe that like people are not great. Like, you know, that people do things that are bad. So I think there is this assumption that like, if things get bad, or and I don't necessarily mean the largest gloom and doom, but, if we don't like the results of an election, or we do like the results of it, whatever it is, it's like that we all turn against each other. And yet you've studied generosity and said that actually that's not necessarily true. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've looked at human cooperation in times of need across many different societies as part of the Human Generosity Project. So we've done field work in Africa, in Fiji, in Mongolia, even in the U.S., in the West, and in Appalachia. And basically all the societies that we've looked at, when things get bad, when there are disasters, droughts, when people lose loved ones and that impacts their ability to do like the work that they need to do, people step in to help each other without expecting to get paid back. And this seems to be something that is really tied to the unpredictability and uncontrollability of the events that precipitate the need. So if something happens unexpectedly and you're in need, then I would help you and not expect anything back. But if it was a different sort of situation where maybe, it was something preventable, or you just, want some resources so you can throw a party or something like that, then I might help you, but would expect that you would do something for me in return. So there seem to really be these two different modes that we go into as humans. One that is more what we call need-based helping or need-based transfers. And that's based on sort of pooling the risk of really bad events with others. And then there's another, which is a more account-keeping mode. And that's for things that are more predictable, more controllable, where you can sort of have this back and forth. But it really seems like it's part of human nature to have this kind of social insurance system. There's something very sort of straightforward and clear about, oh, you need something. I have enough that I can give it to you, and I will just give it to you with an open heart. And the Maasai in East Africa, they're the group that really started the Human Generosity Project, because my colleague Leah, who's an anthropologist, he was studying them and looking at how they cooperate and how they share. Among the Maasai, they have herds of livestock, but sometimes disasters will happen, right? There'll be a drought or disease will happen, and then some of their cattle will die. And when those unexpected things happen, people will help each other. And they do this through a system called osotwa. And osotwa is this very sort of sacred part of Maasai culture. And with osotwa, you're only supposed to ask for help if you're genuinely in need. And then if you're asked by an osotwa partner for help, then you give as long as you can do so without going below what you need. And with just those two things, you get a huge amount of risk pooling happening in actually quite large networks. But individuals only have to be connected one-on-one. But then you sort of build this network out through those connections. And we saw similar things as we started studying other societies as well, that these networks of helping help to provide sort of stability in times of crisis for much larger groups than just the two individuals that were involved in any particular need-based transfer event.
And it's interesting that those two rules apply, and that when it's unexpected is typically when we tend to help someone. So we assess did this thing come out of nowhere? And that's when we go to loved aid. A friend and I volunteered during Hurricane Katrina to do relief, and it was, I've loved volunteering, but there was something about that was oh, we really should go. And I think it was partially because, it was an unexpected thing that felt oh my gosh, we should be a part of this. How awesome to actually support people and do it in a hands-on way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a very sort of natural impulse that we have when we see that there's a need that people have that we have the ability to help with. We want to come in and help.
You also, just to bring this home, you talk about the American West and that being an example of something called neighboring.
Yeah.
Is that the same setup where, you found that people had an agreement that was a mutual agreement, or was this just a natural thing that people do to support their neighbors?
I mean, it kind of is both in a way. With the Maasai, osotwa is maybe a more formal thing. People will be okay, you're my osotwa partner. We cultivate that over time. Oftentimes they're even passed down through the generations. And with neighboring in the American West, so we've studied ranchers in southern Arizona and New Mexico who they're really sort of living the, rancher cowboy life still. They're on these, huge ranches. They're on their, horses most of the day, doing the work to keep everything going on a ranch. They'll often live an hour, 2 hours from their neighbors, right? So it's far, and taking care of everything that you need on your ranch. There's a lot you can do yourself, but if things unexpectedly go wrong, then oftentimes you do need help, and you need help of a certain kind. You need people there who know what they're doing. You can't just go on TaskRabbit and pay somebody $20 an hour to help you with your ranch, right? That just doesn't work. So they have these networks of helping. And when accidents happen or people are ill, whenever there's unexpected needs, they help each other without expecting to get paid back. But as you get to sort of more predictable needs, like branding or taking cattle to market, right? Those are things you schedule. They're things that happen every year. People expect that if they're helped, that they will then help their partner with that same thing. So there is a sort of reciprocity, you could say account keeping, that happens there when you're talking about these needs that arise predictably and where it's sort of more controllable.
So it's like a both and for...
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So what do you say to the person who's listening to you and going, that sounds great with the Maasai or in the American West, but I live in X, Y, or Z metropolitan area. There are so many people around. There are so many opportunities where I could be giving or could be generous. And it's harder to do that almost because there is so much going on. And it's sort of like I live in New York City, right? And so there's an overflow of points in which we can be generous. What do you say to them about our nature around generosity and how they can think about it?
Yeah, well, first let me say we've done research also with an online sample that was largely urban, and we found the same pattern. So this pattern, something that we see no matter where people are. But you have a great point, which is that it can feel a lot harder to be in that generous mindset, to be in that mindset of, oh, you need something, let me give to you, when you're in a very dense environment, when there is a lot of need that you kind of see present all the time. So what I would say is, it's very natural for us as humans to start with the relationships that already exist and then to branch out from there. And I think, the way that I sort of look at it in my life, and I spend time in many different kinds of environments, in more urban environments and rural environments, out in the field, right, in the middle of nowhere. And just sort of starting with, how do I, in the relationships with the people who I'm currently interdependent with, who I'm depending on, they're depending on me, how do I sort of show up in that way as a need-based transfer partner? And then, thinking about, okay, well, now if I have that, I'm doing that, I feel good about that, then who are the people who are more vulnerable, who are part of my community, right? And then you can start to say, okay, well, how could I show up for them to the extent that I have the ability and bandwidth to do that? But we can't kind of put the pressure on ourselves to do it all at once, because if we do, it's just too much. And I think we actually really need to respect our own needs and boundaries. And that's part of need-based transfer systems too, which is you only help if you have the ability to without going below your own need.
Got it. Yeah, so there's a level of protection where I think sometimes when we think about generosity or help, it's like you should go out of your way versus doing nothing at all. It seems like there's sort of like a binary there. So I like that you share that we should have boundaries. And it's also kind of tied to something I've heard you say about the fact that in times of, difficult times or in times of real crises, that we can also create a self-fulfilling prophecy by assuming that people will not actually support each other and assuming that people will just be unkind. Can you talk about that more?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really one of the core ideas in game theory, which is a really, really important tool from economics. And the whole idea behind game theory is that when we're looking at a situation where we can make choices, right? So say we're trying to decide, are we going to cooperate or are we going to just try to get something good for ourselves out of the situation? That the best thing to do is not just based on what sort of we think the outcome will be if we choose A or B, but it's also dependent on what we think our partner might choose. So whenever you're in a situation where the outcomes depend not just on your choice, but on somebody else's choice, that's a game theoretic situation. And so there's a whole field with, math and matrices and computer models and stuff that explores like all these different situations. But there's just a very, very simple fundamental thing that is really relevant for this conversation that comes out of game theory, which is in situations where there can be a temptation to defect, where you could get something if you take the selfish, cheating, exploitative option, that if there's even a glimmer of doubt in your mind that the person that you're interacting with would cooperate with you, then that can actually make you think, oh, I should defect, right? And so then if you play that in the other person's mind, if they are doubting that you will cooperate, then they're going to defect. So having trust and being able to be like, no, like it makes sense in the long term for us to cooperate on this. Or we can both see that like if we choose a cooperation option, things will be better for all of us. And if you can trust and move forward that way, then you can actually reap many more benefits, both individually and collectively, if you have this sort of broader mindset instead of getting stuck in the like, oh, is this person going to try to take advantage of me in this little situation where they could get more? Or are they worried that I would? Because if they're worried that I would, then they might do it. So yeah, so if you're like going into things with mistrust and your partner senses that you have that mistrust, then that can unravel things. And we've probably all experienced things like this in friendships and romantic relationships and even in familial situations where, once you stop trusting each other, it can be very hard to get back to a situation where you can, be cooperative and you can communicate openly and all of those things that are actually really essential for us as humans for being able to operate together effectively to deal with challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds simple, and I'm sure it's not always this simple, but it sounds as simple as, if we both are likely to defect and not cooperate if we feel a shred of doubt, it's like, couldn't we just talk about it and say, let's both be cooperative here?
Yeah.
Like, I know that sounds really basic, and I might be like just making this way too simple, but...
No, it's pretty basic, honestly. Like, it is. The caveat here, of course, is though that like, yeah, most people are generous and cooperative and all of that, but there are some people who are not. And so we also have to have ways of protecting ourselves in those situations. So we can't just blindly trust all the time, but there are some things that you can do to protect yourself without giving up on that open, generous mindset in general. So for example, if you're interacting with somebody who you don't really know that well, you can come at it from a generous and cooperative perspective, but maybe start with something small so you're not putting everything on the line. And if you just lose that, it's not the end of the world. One other really simple thing is, if you interact with somebody who is uncooperative, you've come to it with cooperation and they haven't, then just leave after. If you have the ability, just don't interact with them. Don't put more energy into something where the other person is not willing or able to cooperate. So that's actually a lot of the work that I did on my PhD is on something called the walkaway strategy. It's very, very simple. You always cooperate and you just leave if your partner or group is insufficiently cooperative. And turns out that it works for supporting cooperation both as individuals. It helps protect cooperative individuals from getting exploited. And in the overall population, it creates this sort of structure where groups that have defectors, cheaters, exploiters, etc., are less stable and they get less benefits. And so in the end, you actually end up with more cooperative groups doing better than less cooperative groups if everybody is sort of using this walkaway rule.
So in order to survive, we need to cooperate with each other. But when cheating, pessimism, or distrust enters the equation, our ability to do so falls apart. So what does this mean for our ever more polarized society?
If we are just like aggressive about making friends with people who we disagree with and like trying to understand and not getting caught in the like, oh, I need to bring them to my side or whatever, but just try to understand, then I think you end up finding more common ground than you expect.
We'll be back in just a few moments. And we're back with Professor Athena Aktipis. if we zoom out a bit, I want to talk a little bit more about like larger societal issues. So I'm going to use the example of COVID because that's like a modern day kind of crisis that everyone's gone through. We've just talked about this idea of cooperation and cooperation theory and generosity. And I think we all saw so many examples of people who were being incredibly generous during this time. But also we saw divide, in our own society around beliefs around what COVID could and could not do, how we should be behaving, etc. Like, what do you make of that piece of it?
There's certainly a lot of things going on, right? I mean, among them was just people being physically separated from each other, getting a lot of their information from media platforms that didn't really have a incentive to bring people together. Quite the opposite, really, right? I mean, you get more engagement if you activate people with fear, if you make them feel threatened by people who they perceive as different from them. We actually started a longitudinal research project right as the pandemic was starting. Me and a few members of my research team, we kind of saw it coming, and we started collecting data about a week before the pandemic was declared. And we saw some really interesting things. We saw that if people felt interdependent with those around them, that they actually were able to keep a higher level of cooperation and helping. They reported that even as the pandemic really wore on and people became fatigued from helping. So feeling interdependent, feeling like you have a sense of shared fate with those around you is really important. If you can see and understand that actually you can't thrive as an individual without taking care of those around you to some extent, and that you can't look at the world just through the lens of what the outcomes will be for you. Even if you are selfish, you still can't do because we are fundamentally interdependent with others, and having an appreciation of that seems to help support cooperation even during disasters.
Do you, we are such an independent or individualistic society, right? We have less places and spaces where we feel like community and a sense of togetherness maybe than we have before, at least in modern America.
Yeah.
Even though we talk about being individualistic, do you see that people actually are? Is that real? Is that true when the chips are down or something happens that we continue to stay that way?
I think that there's been sort of a false dichotomy, really, between individualism and collectivism, if you will. Mm-hmm. The example of the ranchers that we've studied in Arizona and New Mexico is, I think, really telling because they have, as an extremely important part of their whole ethic, really strong independence, right? They have these ranches, they manage them mostly on their own, and they require a lot of work and a lot of skill. And the people who run them, they're pretty independent. Mm-hmm. But they also all appreciate that sometimes things happen where you do need help from others. And then they help each other without expecting to get paid back. So I think it really is a trap to sort of think that either you're independent or, you're collectivist. It's well, no, as humans, we like to take care of our own things as much as we can. But then we also recognize that that's not always possible. Even the most, independent modern day cowboys lean on each other when times get rough and they can't take care of what they need to take care of just on their own.
So maybe, and listen, I'm just speculating, but maybe we're not as divided as we tend to be told we are, or as the algorithms lead us to believe if we go down that funnel.
Absolutely. I think, when it comes down to it, people do help each other in times of need, and they help each other across political divides. I actually just posted a poll on Twitter the other day asking, when the shit hits the fan, do you think people will help each other? And it was yes, I voted for Trump. No, I voted for Trump. Yes, I voted for Harris. No, I voted for Harris. And most people are saying yes across the political divides. And in general, most people believe that they would or others would help each other. And what you see in disasters, people aren't oh, wait, who did you vote for before they help? Like people are just like, oh, you need something. And they help. And I mean, in my personal experience, I see this too. I mean, I'm friends with people all over the political spectrum. And, my election party night was one of us was a Harris voter, the other was a Trump voter, and the other was a non-voter. And we all watched it together, and we all mostly agreed about what we thought was wrong with this country.
Wow.
So I think, if you actually get outside of the sort of echo chambers of all of the rhetoric that is kind of meant to divide us, because that's what activates us on these platforms and what sells our attention to various ad company. Like if you kind of get out of that world and just talk to people. And I mean, I try to cultivate friendships with people who I disagree with so that I can understand better where they're coming from. And I don't know, I'm often very surprised at how aligned I am with people who I thought believed things that were totally contrary to what I thought was true. So if we are just like aggressive about making friends with people who we disagree with and like trying to understand and not getting caught in the like, oh, I need to bring them to my side or whatever, but just try to understand, then I think you end up finding more common ground than you expect. I mean, I'm very much a proponent of kind of getting us away from a sort of polarized mindset. And I think like there can be things that, when there are crises, like those can actually further polarize us. So it's like, well, how can you, be supportive without being like, oh yeah, all those people are horrible. Everybody like that. Like they're the enemy. And that's hard because it's an easy way to deal with a crisis is to just sort of demonize others. But, how do we all move forward together? How do we see opportunities not for sort of further division and exclusion, but instead for sort of restoring connection, for bringing people back into the fold who've maybe been marginalized for whatever reason. I think, those are really powerful tools and tools that we've been using as humans for a long time also, right? Restorative justice is something that you see in many small scale societies around the world. Like that's the main way that people try to resolve conflict if they can, is by creating space for people to understand each other and figure out like what needs to be done to make things better for those who were harmed. So, how can we do those kinds of things in our current society today?
Yeah. I mean, I think about, also just being aware of what we're ingesting and what we're taking in and how we aren't immediately aware of the fact that like what we watch and who we talk to and all of these inputs do impact us.
Absolutely.
And like it's either like you can go in an upward spiral or a downward one. And it's not to say that when things feel like they're bad, you should be pretending they're not, but it's, typically it's somewhere in the middle and not really in the extremes.
Yeah, absolutely. And my whole election night experience was really interesting because the three of us, we were going between all of the different news channels, the like super conservative, the very liberal, things in between, where we were watching everything. I mean, we were kind of like wrapping our heads around like all of the different aspects of how people are experiencing the election and seeing where there were like discrepancies. And it was kind of fun. And, we had a lot of laughs during it because we could see like how there was actually a lot of energy and effort that was just on this, like trying to create different coalitions, rather than figuring out how to move forward together. Like it becomes easier to see that when, you're with people who have different beliefs and you can sort of look at the meta level together.
Yeah, it's like go above.
Yeah. And honestly, to me, like that experience and talking with some other people who are from all over the political spectrum afterwards, I think that there's like a sense almost of, hey, like if we all can just see that like chink in the armor, it's like, okay, we don't need to be this polarized. And ultimately, the polarization itself is one of the biggest problems that we have in this country because it makes it impossible to have a really productive dialogue that lets us sort of identify where our shared interests are, where the things are that like we all want to happen, because the focus becomes on the things that we don't agree on and where there is conflict. I personally feel pretty hopeful about, where we can go as a society with a sort of deeper awareness of the potential that we have to cooperate and coordinate and, deal with all sorts of crises, whether they're changes to our political system that we're unhappy with, or, natural disasters where we have to step in and help each other, or, any number of unexpected things that could happen to us that would require us to step in and really be our best selves to deal with.
So, based on what you just said, is there any, threat that's worth us stressing about or going into this kind of like doom and gloom place?
Being stressed about things is not necessarily bad, but being in a mindset of like, oh, this is horrible and this is the end, like that's where the trap is. You can be activated. You can be like, oh, this is something that I need to worry about, but then put that energy towards action, not just like retweeting something and, posting, but, well, what can you do to be ready for a disaster yourself? So I'm a big fan of encouraging people to have a shelter-in-place kit, 72 hours so that you can survive in the case of an emergency. That helps to protect you, but it also helps to protect people who are more vulnerable in your community, because if a disaster does happen, then you don't become part of the humanitarian crisis. And people who are actually most impacted by the disaster, or people who maybe can't afford to have a shelter-in-place kit, are able to get the help that they need.
Right.
So I think it's actually very altruistic to be able to depend on yourself to a certain extent in a time of disaster. So I think that's a very practical thing that you could put some of your stress or anxiety towards if you're like, worried about the end of the world. Get your shelter in place kit together. And then once you have that, you can get your, go bag and your car kit. And I also have like a little adventure kit that I take with me whenever I go, like camping, hiking, etc., so that I'm ready for just random bad things that might happen, which you actually like run into a lot of things, like when you're on road trips or out in the wilderness, where you do need a little kit. So I try to take a kind of adventuresome approach and, do things in my life where you are running up against challenges and dealing with them, and you're also having fun and, being with others, helping others, having a sense of humor, like all of that I think is super important.
Yeah. And if I were to ask you, what's the most important lesson or understanding to take away from your book and from your work? I've heard you say mutually deciding we want to be there for each other is so important. I loved that, because it's, again, so simple. And you called it earlier like social insurance, but the intentionality behind that feels really powerful and simple. Is that what you would say is like the big takeaway, or what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would say that, it really is like we need cooperation, community, and I'd say a sense of adventure, sense of humor to deal with our challenging times.
Yeah, beautiful. Athena, I'm going to have you complete these 3 statements for me. Better humans are
aware of their interdependence and ready to act on it.
Better work is
being connected to a sense of meaning and being able to be effective at accomplishing those goals.
And a better world has
people in it who are ready to cooperate and have some fun.
Love that. Thank you so much for being here, Athena. This was great.
Thank you, Leah. It was great to talk to you.
That was Athena Aktipis, cooperation theorist and the author of A Field Guide to the Apocalypse, a mostly serious guide to surviving our trying times. If you like this conversation, text it to the first person who comes to mind. You never know how it could help them out. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Grace Rubin and Emily Reeves. Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. He makes sure we sound good in the studio. Tim Boland mixed our show. We get additional support from Alex Kuznetsova and Ali McPherson. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Enrique Montalvo is our executive producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Maya Pope-Chappelle is director of content and audience development. Courtney Koop is head of original programming. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and I'll see you next week.